Before we begin the presentation, we would like to take a moment to recognize the Southeast Ohio Manufacturing Extension Partnership, located at the Ohio State University Centers in Piketon, Ohio. This organization is one of 6 manufacturing extension partnerships across the state that strives to help small and medium-sized manufacturers increase sales, create jobs, and generate cost savings through technical innovation, workforce training, and improved management practices. With oversight from the Ohio Development Services Agency's Office of Small Business and Entrepreneurship, Ohio's manufacturing extension partnerships operate as an initiative sponsored by the U.S. Department of Commerce National Institute of Standards and Technology. Through these challenging times, they are committed to offering much-needed resources to Ohio manufacturers through various programs to ensure that the manufacturing footprint in Ohio remains strong. If you have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic and would like more information on resources that may be available to assist you in your recovery, please reach out to your local Manufacturing Extension Partnership representative or a member of the Ray & Associates manufacturing team to get started.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, The Manufacturing Outlook, Managing Business Growth and Profitability in a COVID-19 World, presented by Ray & Associates, a top 100 regional CPA and business consulting firm with offices across Ohio. My name is Imani Fields, and I'll be moderating today's presentation. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items to cover. If you have any questions during today's presentation, you may enter them into the chat box on your screen. We will try to answer as many questions as we can at the conclusion of today's presentation. However, to be respectful for your time, we know that we will not be able to get to them all. Therefore, following today's webinar, we will review all questions and send out the answers via email as soon as we can. Also, if you'd like a copy of today's slides, you'll find that they're available in the handout section of the webinar dashboard on your computer screen. Today's webinar will be given by Kyle Stemple and Ben Froese. As Regional President and Director of Manufacturing and Distribution Services, Kyle has more than 15 years of experience specializing in manufacturing, consulting, tax, and audit services. And Ben Froese, a principal with more than 10 years of experience, specializes in manufacturing and tax, where he's involved with client relations, tax returns, and consulting on various tax inquiries. Today's webinar will discuss how to acquire and target your talent, gain insight on business growth and profitability, recession readiness, and more. And I will pass it on to you, Ben.
All right, I appreciate it, Imani. Thanks for the introduction there. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Kind of what we had on the agenda for today, a couple items. First, if you had joined us on webinar 1, we had talked about kind of what we learned through the pandemic and some of the importance of various items. Now, as we're jumping into webinar 2 here in the series, we're going to look more at what are some of the things we should be considering as we're in the middle of the pandemic, as we hopefully are coming out of this recession, in order to not only help us get through the recession, but set us up to succeed on the other side of it. And so, in line with that, we're going to discuss a little bit about your employees, what you should be considering, in today's day and age, talk a little bit about business growth and profitability in the middle of a pandemic, some of the things you should be considering. And then it might seem a little out of order, but we're also going to talk about some recession readiness too. We might be in the middle of a recession, but never too late to have some of those conversations now about things you should be considering now and then for another recession, whenever that might be. And then kind of end with some of the current economic environment, some statistics, discussion here on where we currently are today. So why don't we just jump right into the employee section here. One of the things that in the manufacturing segment, the three things that are always talked about are people, products, or people, processes, and technology. And people is always the first one when you talk about that, because people drive the processes, people drive your technology and how you implement technology, how you take advantage of technology. And so in today's pandemic environment, what are some of the things that we should be considering when talking about our employees, our employee base? And we should probably be looking at, who do we have, mapping out what skill sets we have, mapping out what skill sets we don't have, where are we missing, where do we have gaps in our skill sets? And now is the time where we can really go ahead and take advantage of the situation where 50% of the manufacturers in the country have laid off or stopped hiring employees. And so that means there's a lot more employees out there, a lot more talent out there now than there would have been, say, a year ago. A year ago, we were talking about what are we going to do to find people? We can't find people that can pass a drug test and show up to work the next day. And now we're in a situation where there's a lot more talent out there. So what are some of the things we can do, we should be considering? Ben, we're talking about employees.
Yeah, Ben, I think it's a great point. When we're talking about, every manufacturer is a little different right now. Some are a little busier than others. Some are as busy as they've ever been. Some a little slower, depending on, we're going to talk a little bit later on about supply chain and that. But I think that, if anything, those companies that came out of the last recession doing extremely well were those that didn't sit back and stop thinking about their business. I've got an article coming out talking about, dumb luck isn't going to get you by anymore. And I think it's imperative that we begin, looking at our people and looking at the talent that we have, as well as what we need to fill the pieces in our organization. And I think it's important that, there are other industries outside of manufacturing that have some people that could be successful in manufacturing, that are laying off, that industries that are really struggling right now. I just think that too often than not, we're not paying attention to our team, assessing, the strengths and weaknesses of our team, and then using these challenges in the economic environment to our advantage. I know it's the most important thing today, I think, is be thinking about how do I come out of this stronger than I went into it, and that's considering our people and our talent that we do have.
Kyle, you made a comment there about other industries having people out there that are potentially laying them off that we may not have thought about as being part of the manufacturing industry. And I think in today's environment where we have so much more technology in our equipment, so much more information we're gathering from the manufacturing floor, a lot of people in the IT industry would be areas where we should be considering, is that a need we have in our facility now? Can we bring someone on to do data analytics, to do gathering of that data, to use artificial intelligence in our manufacturing process to try to gather as much data, interpret the data, and make decisions on that data that will help us, today and going forward. So, it's looking outside of your normal, I need someone on the shop floor to push a button to stamp out a piece of metal, kind of looking beyond that now. What skill set do I need in this new day and age where we can take advantage of some of those?
Yeah. We talk a lot about, acquiring and targeting that talent, what you can do to fill those holes within your organization. But also, I think over the last several years, because we've been pretty much close to full employment, and that, we've probably kept some people within our organizations that might not be the exact fit of what we need. And I think that, we owe it as a service to, the business and our other employees and everything, and as well as those people that, we call it coaching them out. Not everybody is I want to say, not everybody's a perfect fit for our organization. So at times we do have to coach people out. So is as important as it is to look and acquire new talent and find the holes, it's also extremely important to coach out those folks that, are not a perfect fit for the organization, that we've maybe lived with it a little longer than we would have in a normal, had we been able to find people in the past.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the old saying about getting the right people on the bus and getting them in the right seats. So, might be coaching someone into a different position or completely coaching them out of the organization. But in order to succeed, you got to have the right people doing the right things that fit their skill set. Yeah. And kind of in line with that is one of the other tools that we wanted to touch base on today. There are a lot of organizations out there using different personality tests one that we've seen a lot of success with recently has been the Predictive Index. And if you're familiar with it, you kind of know what kind of information that can provide. But basically, it gives you a summary of someone's personality traits, someone's behavioral traits, and then it goes a little deeper into the business world. It gives you a lot of how do you manage someone like this, and what kind of management traits do they have in different positions. And it helps to find a role. It helps find people that will fill a role that you have, and it also helps you identify what kind of person is someone, it's a good person, fits into the organization, fits into the culture, and maybe we need to change their role a little bit to be more in line with their behaviors, their personalities, to make them successful. So
right.
It's one of the things that we've.
Yeah, I think we've had a lot of success using the Predictive Index. I'll call it, some of you may know it as DISC, some of you may know it as Caliper, and there's a lot of different assessments out there. But one of the things that I like about Predictive Index is, to me, it's a little more simpler to the point. The report is a little more manageable from a length perspective, and it doesn't take a high education to read it and understand it. But and it's a very easy one to fill out. I mean, we're talking, it takes employees maybe 10 minutes to fill out that report, or fill out the assessment to get the report. Talk about some of the, Ben's going to flip through, here in a second, and show you a couple of the tools that are on that Predictive Index. But, what I'll tell you, when using these things and using them successfully, I would say 30 to 40% of our hiring decision is based on how the person performs on this report. And it's not, do we like what we see? A lot of times does it fit with the rest of our team? And that doesn't mean, does the person look like the rest of our team? I think what's important when you start getting into team building, and those of you that have teams within your organizations, is that you want a full encompassing team. You don't need 4 people that are the same. So I think when you really get into the dynamics of what these reports and what this will do, there's a whole team, there's a whole exercise in developing teams and making sure that the folks that you have on those teams are going to be able to work well together because of these traits and how they operate. So it takes it kind of to a whole nother level in that. So
kind of circling back around, that's one of the things that we really recommend using as you're trying to acquire talent. You have a role that you need to fill. Use those Predictive Index as part of that hiring process to know, are they going to be a good fit? Yeah, I might like them as a person. I might be able to talk to them, but are they going to be a good fit in that role? And internally at Rain Associates, one of the ways that we've really found that is we've found somebody that's really successful in a specific role. We've identified what is their makeup of their Predictive Index, and we say, in the hiring process, let's find someone that kind of matches that or mirrors that, because we know this person can be successful with this personality traits, with this behavioral traits. Can we use that in our hiring process? And we've been pretty successful in doing that in circumstances here at Rain Associates. So
have Ben show a couple of these samples of out of the Predictive Index, and here's just some graphs and that talking about some different things. The self piece is collaborative, driving, flexibility, social, and it'll do. I will say that I focus less on the graphs than I do on some of the verbiage. But here's something that I really like, and this is right out of the report. So it'll say this individual will most strongly express the following behaviors: socially, informal, so on and so forth. So if you look at those bullet points, number one, it's easy for us to read, as well as it's pretty direct and to the point of how this individual is gonna perform. And like I said, it's basically and I'll call it the innate traits those individuals have. It's programmed in their DNA. I think that, when you talk to people that take these, realistically, you shouldn't test any different every time you take one. But what you finally do and what you learn with experience is you learn how to cope with some of those innate traits about yourself. So you really can't change who you are, but what you can with experience you can change how you act and how you react to some of those things that might not be so impressive on your report per se. I always give the reports back to clients and their people, and one of the things I'll say is, hey, when you read this report, if you don't think this describes you and you don't think it was your report, I said give it to your spouse. They'll let you know whether or not the report hit the nail on the head. So we always get a good kick out of that, and a lot of the people go back and let their spouse read it, and then next time we meet with them, we get some sort of comment in regards to that. But so wrapping up the employee piece there with the predictive index, and whether it's predictive index, whether it's DISC, whether it's caliper, I think that using these things can be very successful when you're putting teams together and when you're hiring people.
Just a couple more examples of some of the information that it provides: management strategies, and then some of the things that they need to consider to work on. I think one area, we talked about using it in the hiring process. Another area is in, on your management team, making people more self-aware of how they come across, how they interact with people, so that they can make changes and be a better manager in that position. So
yeah, I think sometimes people read these and they look at it, and they're pretty critical of themselves. And I want people to understand it's not, you look at the screen there where it said under cautions, may shy away from tough conversations, may have difficulty making unpopular decisions. Well, I think that doesn't mean the person can't learn to do that. It just means that we may have to get them some additional training to overcome that, and just understand that that's not a natural tendency and trait for them. So.
All right, Monty, I think we're going to have a poll question now. If you want to go ahead and throw poll question number 1 up. And as you're answering that, one of the things that I would say is Kyle and I are definitely not experts in the, in interpreting and using those predictive indexes in a HR capacity, but we definitely have people that if you have questions as that comes up, we definitely have people that can help answer some of those questions.
So it looks like 69% said yes, 28% said no, and 3% said never heard of it.
Next section, we talked about employees, and obviously employees have a significant impact on, the processes, your technology, your growth, your profitability. I mean, that's kind of your baseline. That's your biggest asset. Now, as we kind of get a little deeper into some of the other items that we want to talk about, your growth and profitability during a pandemic, be a little more specific and away from your employees, what are some of the things that we should be considering? And let me switch screens here. What are some of the things that we should be considering as we're in this pandemic, as we're going through a recession, as we're looking to come out of the recession? Where do we want to be? What do we want to look like? What are the things that we need to be focusing on to make sure we're successful on the other end of this? Product lines being the first one, understanding where you make money, understanding the costs, your cost to produce an item. Just because it's your most expensive item you sell doesn't necessarily mean it's your largest margin item. Making sure you understand, what kind of money you actually make on a product, and analyzing your various product lines on a going forward basis. That's something that you should be constantly considering. Is there something that we shouldn't be doing anymore? Is there something we should be doing more of? What kind of product mix should we be trying to focus on to make sure we're as profitable as we possibly can be? Do we have some old product lines that are just maybe have some sentimental value because they've been there forever, but they don't make any money? Is, looking at some of those things to make sure you're in the best position going forward.
I think too, be careful with what we say about product lines too. So it may be the same product, but multiple different versions, or, you may produce tables, but there's 50 different tables you produce. So it's not just, I'll say non-competing product lines, but I think what's most important is always looking at those sales, always looking at doing time studies on those to make sure we're making money on those things. And also, it doesn't matter how many things we offer. It's a matter of, are we offering the right products to our customers, and do we really know and understand who our customers are? So don't get caught up in thinking just product line specific, but then how many things you're offering within a specific product line is extremely important as well too. And getting rid of some of those low turn, those items that aren't turning much, and bringing in new ones that customers that would look to, or something new in the market.
One of the things in the current environment that we're living in, and looking at your product lines, the National Association of Manufacturers put out their Q2 survey, which was done, I think, in the May timeframe. So it was, kind of right in the middle of the pandemic. And one of the things that came out of that is they talked about, they asked a lot of different questions to manufacturers. And one of the things that really stuck out to me was that during this pandemic, over 22% of manufacturers, this is throughout the United States, have retooled in some form or another to start producing PPE. And so that's one of the things that, in the current environment, is that, looking at a new product line such as PPE that has a huge market, a huge need right now, is that something that you've already done, or you should be looking at doing? Is there still an opportunity for you in that? I just found that really interesting, that over 22% of the manufacturers in the United States have changed something in their manufacturing process to allow them to produce PPE. I thought that was really, really telling.
It's pretty impressive, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well down in diversification.
So another area that obviously that we should be looking at is, is there something that we can take advantage of in the current situation where you have competitors that are slowing down, that are going out of business? Can you market yourselves in a new way? Can you to take advantage of some of that market share that potentially they would be giving up? Or do you have a competitor that is completely underwater? They don't have the ability to continue to produce going forward. Can you go out and buy whether it's just their equipment itself, and take advantage of some cheaper equipment that might be out there on the market, or to buy the company outright to give yourself that larger market share? There's a lot of companies now, as unknown as we are, the unknowns of the current environment that we're living in. And it seems like, there's good news and bad news every single day. There are a lot of companies out there that are struggling, and not to be crash about it, but do you take advantage of some of those situations and go out and buy one of your competitors now and gain more market share?
I think one of the things we're going to see too is you've got to remember a lot of businesses are still owned by the baby boomers. And, I've talked to a lot of business owners and baby boomers that just want out. They don't want to deal with this anymore. They've seen enough ups and downs, and 2008, 2009 about drove them crazy and wanting to get out. So I've seen some where just say, sell my business, get me out. So I think there are some really good strategic moves that you could be thinking about. The other thing I see the future with more manufacturers doing what I'll call vertical integration in purchasing their suppliers. That they might manufacture 10 different products, but they're all made out of one resin or one wax or something like that. That they're saying that they're seeing where that supply chain is getting so messed up that they don't want to live with that anymore. Therefore, they're looking at going and purchasing that supplier. We're going to talk here. Ben's going to talk a little bit about supply chain, and then I think it's a perfect transition and goes along without saying, is that pay attention, not when you're looking at your competitors. It's not just those that you directly compete with. It's also could be people within your supply chain. It could be, they talked to a client the other day that they needed to hire several new truck drivers. I said, hey, well, have you ever thought about buying a trucking company? Looking at those types of businesses that really are integral to the success of your overall business and operations. And, if you're having issues with something within that and are unable to perform, have you thought about buying them or doing it yourself? So when we talk about buying competitors, it's not just competitors. It could be extremely for vertical integration or buying a supplier as well too. So keep that in mind.
And that kind of goes right into our next point we wanted to touch base on, just in terms of diversification and looking at your supply chain. I have a couple articles, or an article coming out in our Plain and Simple newsletter here, talking about supply chain and looking at the idea of mapping out your supply chain. I don't think this has been something that hasn't been on the front of everyone's mind until really recently with the pandemic and the inability of U.S. manufacturers to get products, whether that's coming from China, whether that's coming across state lines, just with so many shutdowns and everywhere. There's just that the pandemic has really put a squeeze on the ability to get your raw products and to get them across borders. And so looking at your supply chain and mapping out your supply chain has become really important, and looking at, what kinds of things or what areas do I see a lot of risks in my supply chain? Am I only sourcing a product from China? I've been reading some articles recently about some of the PPE stuff coming from China, and there's a company that had $2 million worth of orders that was already produced and sitting there on dock ready to ship this way in China, and China determined that is a national asset, and so they locked it up. And, that's kind of a big, not necessarily, or that's more out of the ordinary, that they would just lock up an entire group of assets, but stuff like that happens. And so it just brings to light the importance of looking at your supply chain and mapping it out. Who are my suppliers? Who are they getting supplies from? My supplier might be down the street, but they need to get their raw material from overseas somewhere. So, and then as you're looking at it, you're mapping it out. You might think, all right, I don't have a lot of risks because I have the ability to get my supplies from two different suppliers. And so, all right, if this guy can't produce it, then this guy can. Well, do you know where they're getting their products from? Are they both getting it from the same location? So you end up getting squeezed in the same way because you can't get it from either one of them. So the idea of working with your vendors, working with your suppliers, mapping out your supply chain so you kind of have an idea of where your risky areas are, and then trying to mitigate those risks. If I have suppliers that are only sourcing out of China, for instance, or somewhere else, can I look at a supplier that's sourcing out of another country or out of the U.S. or having an idea of what your supply chain looks like, where the risks are, can be really important right now.
I think most manufacturers that are maybe slow or struggling today, a lot of it has to do more supply chain issues versus demand for their product or good. So you're seeing a lot more of that. Interruption of the supply chain is definitely a bigger issue than demand for product. I think that's extremely interesting to see. I think the other thing is you really have to pay attention to, is there a way to, Ben talked about 22% of manufacturers that were able to change gears and start producing PP&E. So, if I'm sitting there and I'm a manufacturer today, as part of my plans, and that is, hey, I've got this equipment, I'm manufacturing these products or goods. What if something should happen? What else could I produce with the same equipment? And I think that those companies that were able to, that 22% was 22% of the top manufacturers in the country. Because I think that in order to, it's not just easy to just switch over and start producing a different product or product or good. I think what they were able to do is they really understood their business. They really understood their equipment and what they had, which then allowed them to switch gears because they had great processes and procedures in place. They didn't just do it and have to train all these people to do it. A lot of these people were trained to produce those other things anyway. So I think at the end of the day, I think it's extremely important that we think about those things, as well as what are our processes and procedures should something like this happen again, or I wouldn't say should something like this happen again, when something like this happens again.
Yeah, I think just an example from one of my clients, that the metal manufacturer, and they were able to, in 2 weeks, they took a concept to the production floor. And so they had the processes in place. They were a very lean manufacturing company, and they were able to take it from concept to manufacturing in a matter of 2 weeks, where normally, it'd take months or a lot longer than that in most situations to to get something produced. But because of the pandemic, because of where we were at, they looked at the situation, said, where's the need? What can we do? What is our specialty? And they were able to work that through their system and produce something that there was a huge demand for.
Yeah, Monty, will you pull up poll question 2, and then when you read the responses, will you read the question as well?
So the first question we have here is, have you ever mapped out your supply chain to identify potential risks? Yes, no, or supply chain was not interrupted during COVID-19. Have you ever mapped out your supply chain to identify potential risks? 25% said yes, 60% said no, and 15% said supply chain was not interrupted during COVID-19.
That's interesting. Interesting responses. That's probably not what I would expect, but also fairly good.
Yeah.
I mean, I would. That's high percentage that have mapped that out.
Higher than I would have expected.
Much higher than I would have expected.
Yeah.
So that's great.
All right. Thanks, Monty. The next area we wanted to touch base on is the idea of recession readiness, and this might seem counterintuitive that we're in the middle of a recession. We're talking about being ready for a recession. But I think it's the idea that you can't start too late. Basically, it's being prepared for making decisions when you have to make decisions. What are some of the things that you need to look at now as we're in the middle of a recession? And then this will give you a starting point for what are the things we need to consider next time we get into a recession. Ideally, you're looking at this when times are good, and you're coming up with a plan where you don't have the stress of, I have to cut X percentage of costs. I have to cut X percentage here or there, or employees, whatever that might be. And you're looking at this when times are good. You come up with a plan where you can kind of work through all of your options and determine what are your best options. But that doesn't mean it's too late. We still have the ability to start looking at some of those things now. You may have made some decisions already, whether that was furloughing employees. I think about 30 to 40% of manufacturers had to furlough employees through this pandemic. And so, maybe that's a decision you've already had to make. So what are the next decisions you can and that you might have to make, and start planning out what those look like? Just the idea of a recession readiness is basically come up with a plan, come up with what the action steps are. So if sales drop by 20% or 30% or 40%, how much do we actually have to cut, and put it in dollar amounts, and then come up with the various steps that provide some of those cost saving techniques or whatever that may be, and assign dollar values to them. Don't just throw a bunch of stuff on a piece of paper, but actually assign dollar values to them, prioritize them, say, if this happens, this is going to be our first step. If this happens, this is going to be the next step. And actually put that in writing. And then with anything, the most important piece of it is the accountability piece, because it doesn't matter if you put it on a piece of paper. If you throw it up on your bookshelf and then don't think about it, have no one responsible for it, then it's not going to happen. So making sure you give someone some responsibility and hold them accountable to coming up with some of those, what those options are, can be really important.
Ben, I think you made a really good point. I think that, you plan for these times when things are good and when the emotion isn't there. And I think that's the biggest. If there's one most important thing I would say is key there with that recession readiness, is you're making decisions when the emotions aren't high. We all know that if you didn't have a plan going through this last, some call it a recession, some call it a pandemic. Statistics tell you one thing, the government tells you another thing, and politics tell you something different. So, whatever you want to call what we're in, I think that I saw a lot of stress with businesses not knowing what to do, not being ready, not having these things in place. Ben talked about the different assessing the different dollar values now. We call them levers. If ABC happens, we're going to pull this lever. This lever is going to save us X dollars. Basically being able to map out that process. And not only that, is what are the key performance indicators that we're looking at in order to tell us something bad's coming. As you all know, if you rely on your financial statements alone to make some of these decisions, a lot of times your financial statements aren't getting done timely in order to make a decision in a timely fashion. So what are those key performance indicators that you're managing and measuring and paying attention to within your organization that are going to be that could potentially trigger some of those different levers? And I think thinking about those, and like I said, you'll hear some weatherman predictions at the end when we start talking about the economic outlook in that, because I don't think it's not over. I've got manufacturers that are having record years still, that they've made up all those sales, but I don't think we haven't seen the worst of this yet, in my opinion. And I'll give you a couple reasons why at the end when we get into the next session. But
yeah, one of the examples that I like to use when having this discussion with some of my clients, I use Ray and Associates, ourselves as an example. Back in 2008, one of the things that we did, we kind of acted in the moment, and we implemented pay freezes, we implemented hiring freezes, we implemented some employee reduction, and we are still living with that to this day, because there's a whole level of employees in our firm that we're almost completely missing. We've had to fill in from outside because we eliminated an entire level of people almost, either through some of the decisions we made, or the hiring freezes or the pay freezes, and people left, or we just outright had an employee reduction at that time, and we're just feeling that to this day. And so Ray had made the decision to implement this recession readiness a year or two ago, and we've kind of been following it ourselves, and it just highlights the importance of doing that, because you don't always know the impact of your decisions immediately. It might be a Band-Aid that you're getting through right now, getting you through the situation now, but it's going to impact you well into the future. And the idea is to set yourself up through these situations to where you can, get right back on the horse and go maybe even faster than you were before after the recession. But you can't shoot yourself in the foot just to get through it sometimes. So.
I think that I'll hit a couple of these goals here, on the overall goals of the plan, and the things that you want to make sure, you discuss in there is, you got to look at stabilizing the business, making sure that you're looking at all facets of the business. We're not just paying attention to sales. We're not just paying attention to expenses. We're looking at all facets of the business, all departments of the business. Keeping employees. We need to really focus on keeping the talent that we have and making sure that we weather that storm with that talent. That way, on the other end, we're going to come out, sooner or later. We got to make sure we come out like a steamroller ready to roll. Managing cash and cash flow. I think that this is something that this is the key facet of running a business, is understanding your cash flow and managing that cash flow. Too many people want to look at, hey, what does my income statement say? But honestly, the most important is my cash flow of the business. And cash flow never becomes more important than in a time like today, where cash is king, and cash gives us options. Retaining customers and having that relationship with those customers, and being able to have open and honest discussions, making sure our customers may be struggling. Maybe they're struggling with their own personal cash flow, and that, so their impact of being unable to pay you is going to impact you as well as them. So making sure that you've got good relationships with those customers, and you're staying in discussions with them. Managing the inventory and supply chain, and then obviously minimizing liabilities. Making sure that we are spending money where it should be spent, and not being excessive in any area that's not going to provide back to the business or help us stabilize the business.
One more thing I'll just point out from that National Association of Manufacturers survey is that even now, when there's so many manufacturers that are furloughing employees, that have cut some of their workforce, over half of them still are saying that one of their top concerns is retaining and finding employees. So over the next year, one of their top concerns is still going to be retaining and finding employees, and retaining and finding the right employees.
Right.
So I just, another reason to make sure you're planning ahead and looking at these things, so you don't have an unintended consequence.
Monty, will you pull up poll question 3?
I sure can. This one says, do you have a written recession readiness plan in place? Yes, no, don't need one. 2020 is the last recession we will ever have. Do you have a written recession readiness plan in place? 28% said yes, 69% said no, and 3% says don't need one.
All right. I want to be part of that 3%.
Yeah. That was probably Dustin Raber out there answering that.
All right. One of the last topics we kind of wanted to touch base on is our current economic condition. We've kind of had pieces of that throughout the previous topics here, but I'm gonna go through a couple slides here that we pulled. I have up there. This is actually coming from a Dr. Chad Mautre from the National Association of Manufacturers as a presentation he did, and then just a couple graphs that kind of show this where we're at today. This first one is just the National Association of Manufacturers, the NAM Manufacturing Outlook Index. And basically, as you can see in the last quarter here, 2020, just as you'd expect, the outlook the manufacturers' outlook on the economy is dropped off significantly. The average is about 75% of manufacturers. The 10-year average is about 75% of manufacturers have a positive or very positive outlook. And at the end of quarter 2 of 2020, it was 33%. So, a significant drop there. And I mean, it's nothing that is exactly what we would have expected just in the situation we're in.
I think people's uncertainty in what's going on, every day, the governor threatened to do this and do that, and, this state doing this and that. I think if people would look at their business, I wouldn't be as concerned about business in general. I would be more concerned about what concerns me is not demand for product and that. What concerns me is government intervention and governors closing down states and making it difficult for people to do business. I'm definitely more concerned about that than I am actual demand for products and services.
Yeah. And actually, I don't have a graph in here for it, but the inventory levels have been significantly dropping, and they expect to be in the manufacturing industries. Expect those inventory levels to continue to drop. And what that's going to do is, as soon as there is, it turns the corner. As soon as there's the demand there, the inventory is not going to be there to sell. So there's going to be a huge need for additional production. So at some point, that we will turn that corner and get there.
Yeah.
Next slide is just looking at manufacturing specifically. The drop of manufacturing, just as expected. April, 15, almost 16% manufacturing production dropped just in the month of April, and we've made up some ground in May and June, but definitely haven't got back to where we were before. Next slide here is just looking at monthly unemployment. This is unemployment across all industries. And as expected here, you can see our unemployment rate was above 14% there for a period, and we've rebounded some, but we're still hovering around that 10% unemployment line.
What's interesting about that number that we got up so high so quick? What would it have looked like without PPP? Mm-hmm. When the government did, when the Congress did the Secure Act, they realized that we've got to put money in different buckets in order to get it in the people's and business owners' hands quicker. So, you couldn't have just funded all that through unemployment. They had to do PPP to the employers and that. So that number, you had employers keeping employees on, paying them with PPP money. Even a lot of them weren't even working. So if you think about there was a lot of employers that had to do that. If you think about what would that unemployment rate number have looked like had they not funded that in different ways.
And the majority of that went to small manufacturers. There was, in the manufacturing industry, I think the statistic is 80% of manufacturers have less than 50 employees across the United States. And of those small manufacturers, I think it was 85% of them took the PPP money. And so, just imagine what that unemployment rate would have been specifically in April had they not done that. Next slide here is monthly, just give us another view of what we're looking at in the manufacturing industry. This is the number of employees that are employed in the manufacturing industry in the United States. At the end of 19, beginning of 20, we were just over 12.8 million, and we dropped I think we dropped, the next slide is going to show about 1.3 million in the month of April, just in the manufacturing industry. And so you can see, obviously we've made up some ground May, June, a little bit in July, but we still haven't got back up to those levels of employee levels that we were at beginning of the year.
Yeah, I think a lot of that has to do with still the uncertainty as well as supply chain, not being able to bring full employment back because of, getting goods to manufacture.
And this last one here, before we talk a little bit just off the slide deck, is just summary, some highlights from the last four, including this one, the 5 recessions we've been in. And I just wanted to draw your attention to that manufacturing employment line that we just talked about. Total lost employment during or right after the recession period. It's that middle line. In 2007, 2008, we lost 2.3 million employees in the manufacturing industry. We cut 2.3 million jobs. In April alone, we cut 1.3. But as you can see, we're currently down about 740,000 jobs in manufacturing, and the expectation is that we're going to rebound even further and be down by about 350 by the end of the year. Obviously, still down pretty significantly from beginning of year, but definitely a quicker rebound if this goes as the predictions go, as the weatherman says. Definitely a quicker rebound than what any of the other previous recessions.
A lot of it doesn't surprise me, but I'm going to talk here in a minute about a couple of my concerns going forward. But when you look at this, call it a recession, call it a pandemic, call it what you want, but when you look at this last few months, last time we had the crash in 8 and 9, it was due to overinflated housing prices, which end up causing a lot of bad loans that really had a trickle down effect to a lot of businesses and in the economy as a whole. This issue we're in today was caused by a public health fear. So, there wasn't anything else out there that caused this. Think back at 2008, 2009, the banks had a lot of money loaned out. You look at today, I would say prior to this, banks were in healthier condition than they've ever been. The banks were strong. They had money to lend. Therefore, it's not surprising. I predicted a while back, and I don't know that I would say I was right, but I had predicted, when we went home in March, that come August 1st, we're firing on all cylinders again. And I think there are some businesses that are, but there are also some industries that have taken a significant hit. Obviously hospitality and that. But a lot of our manufacturers are doing extremely well, and the ones that are struggling a little bit does have to do with the supply chain. So here's I'm going to go off the cuff and be a weatherman / economist, because as far as I know, a weatherman can be right every day and an economist can be wrong every day, and they both still have jobs, and neither one of them really ever get it right. So here's my prediction, is that for those of you saying, hey, we're coming out of this and we're not going back, and you don't think you need a recession readiness plan, here's why I would tell you will. I really believe we're not going to really start seeing the true economic trickle-down impact of this till March, April, and May of 2021. And the reason I say that is that when this all happened, people were getting their tax refunds. People were getting government stimulus checks. People got PPP money from their employers and bonuses and hazard pay. People that went on unemployment were getting $600 on top of what they were already making. We had people not vacationing because they didn't want to go out of town. And not only that, you look at the trickle-down effect of, we didn't have travel baseball, travel softball, the travel sports near to the extent that we normally do. So people had, and not only that, people just sat at their houses for 3 months without leaving, pretty much. So people are getting more money. People had more money in their pocket to buy things than ever. So that's what you're seeing now. If you're bouncing back and you're seeing the demand, a lot of it has to do with people have more money. What I think is going to happen is, my estimation, this is my guess, is I would say about 85% of people live paycheck to paycheck. So you start thinking about the number of people that got additional money through PPP, that ended up being wages paid to them, unemployment, these things that they didn't have taxes withheld. And those people, you figure the number of people that normally get a $3,000 refund that are now going to get a $1,000 refund, the people that got $1,000 that are going to end up owing $2,000. So all those people that got that extra money are not very few of them are having taxes withheld at the right level. Therefore, they're not going to get the type of refunds they've got in the past, which those people that live paycheck to paycheck, when they get those tax refunds, they're going and buying a new car. They're going and buying a new washer and dryer. They're going and buying new furniture. All those things that they need to keep their house up going, and those type of things. So I really believe we haven't seen the worst of this. And come March, April, May, we're really going to start seeing that come tax time. Something else that I would say that we're getting, I'll say, close to being dangerous on is the housing market. Housing market, if you're paying attention to it, it's getting a little out of whack again. And you got almost all-time low interest rates on a 30 and 15-year mortgage, and these home prices are getting a little out of hand. So I'm hoping we're not heading back to another 2008, 2009 issue on housing, or we may be creating an issue all over again. But when you look at those things, because of all those things, is why I'm predicting that it's really going to hit us March, April, May next year, maybe even into June. So I don't think if you haven't done a recession readiness plan, I don't think you've seen the worst of it. I hope I am wrong, but it just seems like as you think about it, that those things align and it kind of makes some sense.
Yeah, and what we're not considering here is whatever the government decides to do on future programs to put money back into people's hands. So that's always an unknown with the political environment we're in. What's going to get passed? What's not going to get passed? What can they actually do? So.
Yep. We're in an interesting time, and I think November is going to be extremely interesting to see what happens, and depending on what happens can have a major impact on where we're at in the economic outlook and where we go and what that looks like. So little difficult to predict, but the other thing that I've heard a lot of people say is if you look back at history, a lot of the things, the way they're lining up today, they've never lined up like that before in history. So you can always use history to predict the future, because a lot of things aren't acting in the same. They're not acting against each other, not acting in tune with each other. So,
all right, Monty, you want to pull up the last poll question we have?
All right, so the last question we have here is, I'm optimistic. Will we return to our pre-pandemic growth by the end of the year? Yes, no, and I'm growing faster now than I ever was before. And we'll give you guys a few seconds to answer that question. So it looks like 35% said yes, I'm optimistic we will return to our pre-pandemic growth by the end of the year. 58% said no, and 8% I'm growing faster now than I ever was before.
I think Kyle may have skewed that last question with his most recent comments. But do we have any questions out there for us?
Yeah, we have a question for you guys. And while we let the guys answer this one, if you guys have any more questions that you want to send to us, please do so now. So this question says, does Ray have a sample recession readiness plan, something to get us started beyond the slides today?
Yes. Jot down Ben or my email address. Send me an email. We can get you a sample.
Awesome. And I'll let you guys kind of give your final thoughts. And if we don't get any more questions, then I will wrap it up for you guys today.
I think biggest takeaway that I'd say from today is just thinking about what your options are, planning ahead, not making decisions based on emotion, but based on what's the right decision for the company, and thinking about what's the right decision that's going to set us up for growth when that opportunity comes. So.
Ben, I think you summarized it all pretty good. I mean, I think for me is we are in unprecedented times and things we haven't seen in the past. And, you want to be as I'll say strategic in that as you can be, and making sure that you're getting your leadership team and your trusted advisors together to have some of these discussions. And I know we've had a lot of discussions with clients, especially through the PPP program and that, and helping clients do that. And obviously, those of you still paying attention to that know they keep changing the rules on it. And I think that the end of this year is going to be interesting because of my fear is a lot of this stuff that they're supposed to act on because of the politics going on and that, and because it's an election year. My concern is them getting these things done and getting these things addressed. So I would say, be ready. I think you've got time to still build a plan. I don't think, like I said, I don't think we've seen the worst of it yet. And I think that you've got time to plan and making sure you get those individuals involved. Any other questions, Amani?
Nope, that was the last question. And of course, they can reach out to us and you guys' emails on the screen there.
We appreciate everyone's time. Hopefully you've got a couple takeaways from it, some things to think about for your business. And Ben and I's contact information is up there. If you ever have any questions, comments, concerns, please reach out to us. Reach out to your other Ray advisors. We're here to help, and anything we can do to help you guys out and is our goal.
Thanks, guys. You guys did a great job today. And thank you guys for joining us on today's webinar, The Manufacturing Outlook, Managing Business Growth and Profitability in a COVID-19 World. We hope that the team was able to provide you with some valuable insight in regards to best practices and potential solutions. If you sign off today and realize that you have additional questions, you're always welcome to reach out to Ben and Kyle directly. And thank you, and we hope you guys have a great day.